You're listening to The Back 40, the podcast for Ontario farmers, covering topics and issues that matter most to Ontario agriculture. Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm the host of The Back 40, Mike Brine, agribusiness specialist at Trillium Mutual Insurance. It has become more than just a bit of a thought process to how we do supply any astronauts that may end up on Mars, as we have several projects now that are talking about putting people on Mars. I'm talking today with Lenore Newman and Evan Fraser, and they've been through a thought process, a thought experiment here about what we might eat if we ever get to Mars. And they have published a book, and it's called Dinner on Mars. Evan, Lenore, welcome to the Back 40.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks very much for calling, Mike.
So I'll start with you, Evan. What was the genesis of the idea for the book?
Well, I think if you go back to that February and March of 2020 that we all had, and the pandemic was racing over the world, we were all cooped up initially at home. There was no toilet paper anywhere. And Lenore and I started texting each other. And normally, Lenore and I do a lot of travel. Lenore as a professor on the west coast of Canada, me as a professor at the University of Guelph in Ontario. And we would study food systems all over the world. But of course, in March of 2020, all of our travel was taken off our calendars. And we started imagining where could we go and study a food system, and decided that the only place we could go was in Mars, and we would use our imagination to do that. It's a thought experiment born out of the anxiety and frustration of the first lockdown. And it was essentially Lenore's and my coping mechanism on how to adapt to losing our lives, as we all did.
So, Lenore, what's your background and areas of expertise that leads you to explore this type of a project?
Well, I was born in the food system to start with. My family owned a small fishing company, and I actually grew up on a halibut boat. So I'm no stranger to small spaces that are remote and where you really have to be self-sufficient. Then in my career, I'm trained as a physicist. Then I've applied that in the food system, and I work in food security, and I'm the director of the Food and Agriculture Institute at the University of the Fraser Valley out here on the West Coast. Our catchphrase is building tomorrow's food systems. So we spend a lot of time thinking out here at UFV about the future of food. So this is a natural extension of that work in a lot of ways.
Evan, what's your background on this?
Yeah, so I direct something called the Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph, and I'm a social scientist, but I study agriculture and technology. Like Lenore, I've got an origin story that was rooted in the food system as well. My grandfather on my dad's side was a farmer in the Niagara area, and I would spend summers hoeing strawberry fields and picking sweet corn and putting mulch down, dragging irrigation pipes around the old family farm. And equally important, or arguably more important than my summers working with my grandfather, was my mom is a consummate host that builds communities and convenes families and does it all through the power of good food, lovingly prepared around a dining room table. So, firmly embedded like Lenore in the food system from my youngest age, and have turned it into a vocation and a profession at the University of Guelph.
So, Lenore, I'm going to let you start on this. Did the film The Martian get it right, or are there some holes in that?
Oh, that's funny. And, you're the first person to ask that, because I'd kind of forgotten about the film, to be honest. Did it get it right? Well, I mean, I do find that astronauts are quite sexy, so that part's right. I actually think, though, the food system they proposed, which, if I recall, was sort of a potato-based system, was actually fairly legit. And I think one of the other key things is there was this sort of self-sufficient element to it. However, the one real difference between what is shown in that movie, which is a tale of survival and innovation, it's a very different thing to keep, say, 100,000 people in a community alive. And it's a much more complicated problem than keeping one person alive in a very extreme environment. So I would say yes, with a tiny nod to needing to scale what we see there really extremely.
Evan, do you want to comment on that too?
Yeah, I've got sort of one word to say, and it's cyanobacteria. And the big revelation for me, or one of the big revelations for me in writing this book, was that you're going to need a fundamental engine that turns minerals and elements you can find on Mars into organic matter. So we know that there's water on Mars in the form of frozen water particles in the sand of Mars called regolith. We also know there's a lot of carbon dioxide. We know there's other minerals present, salts and things like that present in the environment. But you need a way of turning that into organic matter. And really, what the basis of the food system is, yeah, it's going to be potatoes, but the potatoes are going to have to grow on something other than human poop, which I think is what Matt Damon does in The Martian. And I think you're going to need big vats of cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, sometimes called spirulina, which will basically be your engine of primary production that turns basic ingredients you can find on Mars into some organics. And then on the basis of those organics, you'll be able to grow potatoes accompanied by really, really careful recycling of all water and nutrient material. They didn't get cyanobacteria in The Martian, as I recall.
No, and the question that I have my background also in crop, is the soil, not just adding manure to it, is the soil suitable to grow things? And they didn't get into that too deep because, of course, that kind of spoils the story as we go. But one thing that did happen there was the accident that took out his greenhouse, which, if that sort of thing were to happen to a colony on Mars, could be devastating. So why not just supply from Earth? Why do we have to, or why should we grow our food where the people are? Why not just bring it from Earth?
Yeah, that is, of course, the billion-dollar question or trillion-dollar question. And the truth is, it's just not possible. It's not even possible on a small scale for a small expedition. And I want to make it clear in the book, we are talking about feeding, a couple 100,000 people. Even if we were trying to keep 50 people alive on Mars, the technical requirements and the cost of sending material to Mars is just too high. Takeout is not an option on the red planet. And that is actually one of the most challenging elements of this, much as early explorers of the Arctic starved to death because they couldn't get resupply. The Martians are going to be on their own for the most part.
Two basic numbers that illustrate Lenore's point. One, it takes 7 months to get from Earth to Mars, 14-month round trip, just in transit. And then at current rates, I was just looking this up on NASA's website a couple of days ago, it's $10,000 per pound of payload to lift off of Earth. So that's the cost of just getting stuff out of Earth. It is far too far for takeout or a brown bag lunch approach. And only conceivable way of maintaining a Martian colony is indeed through self-sufficiency.
Yeah, I think that you've touched on something there that a lot of people don't necessarily consider, and that's the expense of getting things out of what you'd call Earth's gravity well. You're left with only option is to actually grow it there. What are some of the challenges of that when you get to Mars, or even getting to Mars? What are some of the challenges that they're going to face? You talked a little bit about cyanobacteria. What other challenges are we going to be seeing when we get there?
One of the key challenges of growing on Mars is dealing with very little solar energy. So Mars is a lot farther from the sun than Earth, and so there's only between a half and a quarter of the amount of solar energy that arrives. Plants need sunlight, and there isn't as much sunlight there. At the same time, Mars doesn't really have much of an atmosphere, so it gets way more harmful radiation. So concentrate the sunlight and filter out the radiation, then you've got to deal with really cold temperatures for the most part. That would be, freezing, very light pressure. So it's very little in the way of atmospheric pressure. So you're going to have to create habitats that are pressurized, that are shielded from radiation, that are kept warm. You have to contend then, of course, with the fact that there is absolutely no organic matter there. So there is no topsoil to draw upon, and water will be vanishingly scarce. So it is a punishing environment to imagine producing food in. It is also an environment that will force us to become incredibly efficient in terms of recycling everything and creating what we might call a circular economy of food, where the waste of one step is used as a resource of another step. And so in that regard, I think the discipline of imagining a food system on Mars would actually be very beneficial as we imagine Earth-bound food systems, which are very wasteful of resources and take a tremendous amount of resources to run.
Yes, and the biggest problem I think with a lot of the Earth systems is they're not circular, and we take too much out of them without replenishing or bringing back those resources that get taken out of the system and wasted. Evan, you talked about no organic matter there. So if we've got no organic matter there and we have to grow everything there, how do we overcome that?
And that is it's one of the early challenges. And the one I would add to Evan's list is even the low gravity will lead to some interesting challenges in plant breeding to start with. So the problem is, yeah, you're building from scratch. And so there are a number of steps that one has to take. And as Evan has pointed out, cyanobacteria is really one of your building blocks. And the one thing, and if we go back to the Martian getting something wrong, one of the challenges is the soil itself is toxic. The Martian regolith, you can't just use it as soil. So you basically have to start by mining to get lunch on Mars. The soil needs to be processed. We'll need to take out the water and put it aside because we'll need it later. We'll need to then treat the soil with cyanobacteria, which will do two things. It'll reduce the toxins, and number two, it'll create an organic base that we can work from. And from there, we can build up the food chain using hydroponics. So the Martian soil is like a little store that'll sell you everything you need to do a hydroponic farm. You have to build everything from scratch.
When you're talking building from scratch, you're meaning right from scratch. You're talking back to carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, going right back to the base atoms.
Molecule by molecule. We do this on Earth too. When we fertilize a field with chemical fertilizer, we've literally put that together from scratch, using the Haber-Bosch process to tear the nitrogen from the air and mining the potash, etc. So it just takes it even further back. Basically, molecule by molecule, you'll put this together. Once you get it going, though, then you'll have these tight closed loops where you're dumping your waste organics back into the system, and that will make things a little easier.
Very important, though, to conserve everything there. When you start talking about a closed loop, if you spend that much effort to make the building blocks, you can't waste them. They've got to be reused.
Let's just say there's no garbage on Mars.
That is an interesting concept all on its own. I'll bet we could make a full podcast out of that. What about things like we need to collect the energy somehow and the plants need light? Are we looking at some sort of a greenhouse? Are we looking at lighting that put them in a cave and put the proper lights over the plants? Combination of both, and where do we get the resources for those particular things?
That's a very good question as well. I mean, solar is going to play a big role, which once again, we're going to have to mine material, make solar panels, and we'll take some solar panels with us. Realistically, we will also probably be using nuclear energy because it's the one source that gives us a lot of bang for its weight. In an ideal world, we'll have nailed nuclear fusion, which makes this problem much easier. But if we were doing it today, we would probably take a couple of nuclear reactors like the kind they use on submarines with us. And that itself is, a dangerous and kind of terrifying undertaking, but I think it would underpin our system a little bit. Evan, do you have any thoughts on where we're getting all this electricity we need?
Yeah, so I mean, I think nuclear is going to absolutely play a role. To reference my previous comment that Mars is farther away from the sun, so you're not just going to have solar panels, you probably will also have like solar collectors. And some of the sci-fi blogs I've been reading sort of imagine large mirrors suspended from balloons or in satellites, focusing the sun's energy onto solar farms that then get turned into electricity. In terms of greenhouses, you could imagine solar energy being concentrated into some domed craters, and you could even use some ice to create the domes, or Martian-based sand, because there's lots of silica and stuff to make sand with. And there, what the key thing would be to create a surface that allows warmth to get through, but filter out the harmful radiation. But I think the majority of the plants will be grown deep in caves using LED lights, much like a vertical farm would be today, where you've got banks of plants growing underground where they're protected from radiation in hydroponic solutions that are themselves nourished by the cyanobacteria tanks, and using extremely sophisticated LED lights so that every plant gets exactly the right intensity and the right wavelength of light at the right moment to optimize plant growth. And here we're seeing in Earth technologies really big advances being made in terms of being able to change the flavor and the size and the nutritional qualities of plants simply by tuning the wavelengths correctly. So there's a lot of really neat science about LED lighting and plant interactions that will go into, I think, the vertical farms more than the greenhouses on Mars.
Is your organization in need of funding for a capital project? Trillium Mutual's Roots Community Fund provides funding towards projects such as renovations, expansions, and equipment purchases that support rural Ontario. Roots helps ensure that these organizations will remain a crucial part of the local community. To learn more about Roots, including how to apply, visit our website at trilliummutual.com and click Community at the top of the page. So, on Earth, a lot of our protein source comes from animals. Are we going to be using animals as a protein source on Mars, or is that something that's just not going to happen?
I think one thing we can definitely say with some confidence, there will be no animal agriculture on Mars, because animal agriculture is heavily inefficient. And it makes no sense from an energetics point of view. And Evan and I kicked around taking animals into space, and it's too inefficient. There is no way you could feed them. And so plants really have to top out the system on Mars. But I also think that that's what we'll see happen on Earth in the next 50 years or so as well, if we're to actually survive the effects of climate change.
That 50-year conversation is probably, as I say, there's another whole podcast on that one. I guess my objection to animal agriculture in space is even more basic than that, in that animals don't produce protein, they process protein. So you're bringing something into space that you say, Lenore, is very inefficient at what it does when you don't actually need it. The protein's got to come from the plants in the first place anyway.
Really, if we look at animal agriculture, it's solely an addiction, in that the only reason we still do animal agriculture at scale is because we like the flavors and textures, etc. And I'm using we a little loosely because I actually eat plant-based, and culturally, meat is incredibly embedded. And I actually think Mars will be a great training ground for developing diets that don't have those animal products in it, because people will be ready for things to be different, because, the planet is different, the gravity is different, probably won't seem that strange. On Earth, it's going to be very disruptive, very large scale change. I do feel it will happen though.
So you've touched on something there, like we can produce protein and energy in a vat, and it's nutritious and it supplies everything that we may need to survive. But we're talking two different things here. One is supplying the nutrition for people, and the other is supplying food for them. And there's a distinct difference between that, because I'm not sure that anybody would do well just having a shake of whatever it tastes like and not getting that taste of food. Can you comment a bit on that, Evan?
I thoroughly agree with what you just said, Mike. People don't live by algae bar alone. And for most of us, not everybody, I don't want to generalize to the entire human experience, but for most of us, a good quality diet, and a diet that tastes good and that we enjoy, is actually part of people's mental health, and it's part of their culture, and it connects them with their families and their past. So we can't ignore the food aspect of nutrition, or we would at our peril. And there's lots of studies to suggest that people in tough environments need to eat well in order to feel good. And some of this, Lenore mentioned the fact that we'd be probably using nuclear reactors from submarines. Well, I talked recently with someone that did food for U.S. nuclear submarine. And those are hard environments. And so they really feed those sailors. Apparently, I don't have firsthand knowledge of this, feed those sailors well. So yeah, we have to make sure that this food tastes great, reminds us of home, all the rest of that stuff, while actually being produced with very, very different sets of ingredients than we are at home, and notably without cows, pigs, or chickens. But luckily here we have a bunch of technologies which are not quite there yet on Earth today, but are rapidly maturing. Lenore and I ate some cell ag sashimi a few months ago in San Francisco. And, there are companies that are producing products that are so close to what we would normally consider to be meat. They're still expensive. They're still very niche. They haven't passed the regulatory approval, but they do offer a way forward where consumers will be able to enjoy products that they remember fondly from their childhoods and they like eating, but will be made out of vats much more often than they're made out of animals or birds.
We've long since used artificial flavorings in foods, and some of them even taste somewhat like what they're supposed to. But we're really talking about here is the texture of the food, and that maybe is the biggest challenge, isn't it?
I actually disagree. I think we have everything we need to put together a really good diet out of the basic building blocks we're talking about. And part of that is because so much of what we do is fermentation based and technologies that do move. So, for example, when the first Korean astronauts went into space, we developed space kimchi to go with them. And I always found that as just such a iconic little element that they actually engineered kimchi to go to space. And I guarantee you there'll be kimchi on Mars because it's that kind of deep umami. And it is, yeah, we're probably going to have these key plant foods. And I will say the other thing Evan and I realized pretty quickly, we will ferment everything on Mars, just like we do anywhere we go. And I'm pretty sure that 6 months into the colony, when we've set up the first domes and things are working, someone will have a still going somewhere. Alcohol will quickly flow as it always does.
You're going to have a lot of plant material there, and certainly that's the basis of all that fermentation and those stills is to find that proper substrate to create the alcohol.
Let's pause here for a sec, Mike, because Lenore's raised what I think is actually one of the most interesting pieces of technology that I had never even heard of before writing this book. And now I'm thinking that this is potentially the next big thing. And that's using microorganisms, could be yeasts, could be bacterias, could be funguses, to turn essentially starches and sugars into something else. And humans have been doing this for thousands and thousands of years in terms of producing booze. And that's great. But since the 1990s, for instance, almost all of the world's insulin has come out of an advanced or precision fermentation process. So almost all the insulin used by diabetics today is a fermented product. And then since about 20 years ago, almost all of the world's rennet, which is an enzyme used to make cheese, has also come out of a fermentation process. Traditionally, rennet comes from the stomach lining of cattle. We make too much cheese for that source of rennet. So for about 20 years, we've used precision fermentation to ferment rennet, which then gets used for cheese. And we're really just now scratching the surface of what fermentation can do for us. So another product that Lenore and I ate in San Francisco earlier was a fermented dairy product, and it's a microorganism that produces whey protein and is used in non-animal dairy products, ice cream, cream cheese, and they're really, really good products. They're excellent quality products. And I'm aware of some folks now that are fermenting what would otherwise be considered pork fat. I'm aware of people fermenting casein, which is another form of protein that you use in making cheese. And I think that in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to see a huge explosion of products that can be fermented that we would traditionally associate with livestock. And that will be a massive new set of tools in terms of not only feeding Mars, but also feeding the future of humanity on Earth.
Yes, and in a way we could say there will be cows on Mars. They'll just be very small. And,
one of the other things that I read in the book and I found very interesting, and I direct this one at Lenore because you grew up in the fishing industry. You've talked about producing fish essentially using a 3D printer. Can you comment a little bit about that process?
yes, and as Evan mentioned, we actually got to try the fish produced by the company Wild Type, which is located in San Francisco. And that is roughly what they do. Not quite. There's a number of ways you can do this. Cellular agriculture, which is attracting a lot of attention globally, involves taking cell cultures, culturing them in a growth media, and then giving them shape, either using scaffolds or by using 3D printing techniques to produce biologically equivalent animal products. Fish is getting a lot of attention because the bulk of the world's fish, about over half, is still wild caught. And those fisheries are in crisis. The demand for seafood is skyrocketing. The jury is still out on whether fish farms produce a good product that works. There is an incredible demand for this sort of substitute. And yeah, we actually went and tried some salmon sashimi that never splashed in an open ocean. And it really did. You know, as someone who grew up in the industry, it blew my mind. It was definitely not a plant. We'll put it that way. It was definitely meat, just meat that didn't come from an animal. And that is so strange.
Flavor and texture similar, or is it just a new taste experience?
I would say they're about 97% of the way there. Now, we ate the raw, unadulterated product. If they were to put it in a poke bowl, for example, I wouldn't be able to tell. And I know a lot about fish. It's close enough that I wouldn't be able to tell. Now, this is still an experimental product. It's still very expensive. It doesn't cook right yet. There's a lot of problems to solve. But the interesting thing is, because these are technologies rather than animals, the development follows Moore's law. It gets exponentially better with time. And in 10 years, these substitutes will probably be better, healthier, cheaper. You know, in the end, they'll probably win.
And for fish, no microplastics, for instance, just as one example of where a cell-cultured salmon sashimi would offer a consumer some obvious benefits over the real thing.
Or mercury, for that matter. You'd have to add the mercury in if you wanted.
Yeah, like soy sauce. Have a little mercury dipping bowl just to make it authentic.
Just as long as we don't use it as an excuse not to clean up the oceans and get the microplastics and the mercury out of there just because we're not eating the food.
Mike, this is such an important point you're raising, because one of the things that Lenore and I drill into is the potential for these technologies writ large to help reduce agriculture's environmental impact on Earth. So if we can farm, for instance, in a small space that's highly controlled, maybe we can spare land elsewhere and clean up land elsewhere, or clean up the ocean because we don't need it. But that's only going to happen if we have policy and programs designed to do that. So the technology is never going to be a panacea. It simply will provide us one tool by which we could reduce pressure on the natural earthbound environment, but it is up to humanity to decide whether or not protecting the environment actually results from our embracing of these technologies. So that's a really important point you're raising.
We've gone through a lot of the benefits that we could potentially see here on Earth, but I think you've touched on there that maybe the biggest challenge that we have is not the technology, it's the social aspects around it, and whether there's that political will to make the changes necessary to implement some of these things.
I'll admit I'm an optimist, and part of that is, as a professor working with young people, I truly believe that at their root, humans are not sociopaths by nature. They want to equally share resources. They want to be good people. They don't want to be cruel and thoughtless and destroy the planet. And when I look at the policy landscape and how that plays out on the government scale, the benefit I see to these technologies to this question is they make it easier to do the right thing. If we can produce beef that is cheaper, healthier on 2% of the land base, using a tiny fraction of the resources, the technologies will be used, and we've seen that throughout history. I think the problem with trying to get people to address the giant issues we face now is it's very difficult, and it isn't clear what we need to do. So I see technology as kind of helping us along, and I think I'll probably toss to Evan for his take on this now, but I'm an optimist. I think at heart we want to do the right thing.
I mean, I'm pretty optimistic too, but I may come down a little more pessimistic on this one. A couple of years ago, I wrote another book called Uncertain Harvest, The Future of Food on a Warming Planet. In it, the co-authors, Ian Mosby and Sarah Rotz and I, really sort of focused on the social elements and the policy elements, and we didn't get as excited in that book about the technological breakthroughs that were going to help. And I feel like I've sort of switched horse mid-race on this one, because since we wrote Uncertain Harvest, the world has gotten hotter, the number of species has declined. I haven't seen the sort of proactive policy that's changing the nature of the system. At the same time, I've been hanging out with Lenore a lot more. I've been reading about these crazy technologies. The scientists around the world have been knocking off technical hurdle after technical hurdle. We've now got cellular agriculture and precision fermentation at a much, much further state than we did in, say, 2018 when I was doing the research for this previous book. And so I'm increasingly thinking that a technologically led approach supported by enabling technologies is actually the pathway that humanity needs to take if we're not going to completely destroy the planet that we've currently living on. And let's face it, I mean, the idea of a community on Mars is a nice thought experiment, but it's not a realistic strategy for humanity. It's not an exit strategy for humanity. We have to save planet Earth.
I think that what you're talking about there is that ultimately economics will drive it. If the food from processing, if it becomes cheaper than that which is grown in conventional agriculture, then it will become the norm. People will buy it because it's less expensive for their diets.
I think you're probably right.
So what was the benefit of going through this exercise for each of you?
I mean, aside from the immediate benefit that, it helped ease the fact that I went from, doing field research in Australia to frantically coming home to be trapped in a small apartment that I usually don't spend that much time in. But I think at the end of the day, it reminded me that these questions really do have strong implications for how we do things on Earth, and that success on Earth in the food system really means treating it a bit more like Mars. I also think that at the end of it, I am very convinced we could do this, that it's even within our reach given the technology we have now, which I was a bit on the fence at the start. I didn't even know if we could support a city on Mars, but I believe we can. And I think it does have a lot of implications for how we'll do things in 30 or 40 years on this planet, where we don't use raw nature so much as a crutch, which is our big problem right now. It's like someone left us an inheritance, and we keep spending our capital to keep getting by. And it made me feel that, no, we really could develop a system that's self-sustaining forever, that lets us allow most of the planet to go back to, a more wild state.
For me, I think the thought experiment of going to Mars, or the real benefit of perhaps NASA or the Canadian Space Agency or the European Space Agency, whatever, the space agencies tooling up to do that, I think ironically, the real benefit will be to better connect us with nature. It sounds weird to say that, but on Mars, we can't be, like Lenore just said, treating the planet for granted. We can't use it as a sort of an endless supply of raw resources and a place to dump our waste and all that stuff. And we can't just assume there will be tasty species to eat that we can harness and cultivate. It's going to take work and efficiency and discipline to build a food system on Mars. And it's going to have to work in cycles, a circular economy like nature's supposed to. And so I have a feeling that the exercise of putting a group on Mars will be, there will be neat technologies developed and matured as a result of that sort of incredible, intense work. And both in terms of the mindset, but also in terms of not taking Earth for granted, will help us make our current food systems, or the food systems, the vast majority of humanity will depend on, much, much better for the planet.
The book is called Dinner on Mars. We've been speaking with Evan Fraser and Lenore Newman, the authors of the book. When is this book available, and where can people find it?
The book comes out on October 11th. It will be available all the usual places that people will find their books. And I'm always, as someone who writes, I'm always encouraging people to support their local bookstore.
That's awesome. Evan and Lenore, thank you very much for joining us today on the Back 40.
Thank you very much.
Kindly.
You've been listening to the Back 40, Brought to you by Trillium Mutual Insurance. Be sure to subscribe to The Back 40 wherever you find your favorite podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. The Back 40, bringing the ag community together one podcast at a time. I'm Mike Brine. Until next time, take care and stay safe.